The crack of a single gunshot split the desert air at Forward Operating Base Vanguard, but it wasn't from any weapon Private Emma Hayes was holding. Sergeant Major Colt Brennan had just fired one round straight into the cloudless California sky, his voice carrying across the live-fire training range like thunder across a canyon. Hold, everybody hold. 80 male recruits froze mid-movement, their heads turning in synchronized confusion toward the observation tower where Brennan stood, his weathered face contorted with something between disgust and theatrical fury. The morning sun blazed at 800 hours, turning the sand beneath their boots into a shimmering heat trap that would only get worse as the day progressed. Advanced infantry training at Vanguard wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to break people who thought they were already warriors. Brennan descended the tower stairs 2 at a time, his boots striking each metal step with deliberate force. 23 years in the Marine Corps had carved him into something hard and uncompromising, a man who believed the old ways were the only ways that mattered. His ribbons told stories of Fallujah, Kandahar, and places whose names were still classified. Every soldier on that range knew his reputation: excellence through brutality, respect through fear. He walked through the formation with predatory patience, eyes scanning faces, until he stopped directly in front of Private Emma Hayes. She stood at parade rest, her regulation uniform crisp, despite the heat-brown hair pulled back in a perfect bun that revealed nothing of the person beneath the protocol. At 5'6", she was notably smaller than most of the men surrounding her, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed during the 3 weeks she'd been at Vanguard. "You," Brennan said, pointing at her with one thick finger. "What's your name? Private Hayes, Sergeant Major?" "Hayes." He drew out the syllable like he was tasting something unpleasant. "You think you belong here, Hayes? I'm here to train Sergeant Major." "That's not what I asked." He moved closer, his voice dropping, but still carrying to every witness present. "See, I've been doing this for longer than you've been alive, and in my experience there are soldiers who earn their place through blood and sweat, and then there are diversity quotas that the politicians force down our throats to make some committee in Washington feel good about themselves." A ripple of laughter spread through the formation. Emma's expression didn't change. Her gray-blue eyes remained fixed on the middle distance, a 1,000-yard stare that might have meant shock or might have meant something else entirely. Brennan bent down and picked up an M16A1 that had been lying near the equipment shed. The rifle was clearly old stock, probably pulled from reserve storage or salvaged from a unit that had upgraded to modern platforms decades ago. Rust spotted the barrel like a disease, and the stock had a visible crack running along its grain. He held it for a moment, then let it drop to the dirt at Emma's feet with a metallic clang that echoed across the silent range. "Pick it up, beauty queen." Emma looked down at the weapon, then back up at Brennan's face. "That's an order, Private." She bent slowly, both hands wrapping around the rifle as she lifted it from the dust. The weight was familiar, the balance slightly off from what modern soldiers trained with, but not wrong. Just different. She brought it to port arms, the rust leaving orange streaks on her palms. "Now here's the deal," Brennan announced loud enough for the entire company to hear. "This private thinks she can hang with the best infantry soldiers in the U.S. military, so we're going to give her a chance to prove it. If you can pass today's kill house drill with that rifle, Hayes, then maybe I'll start believing you're not just taking up space that should belong to someone who actually wants to fight." Captain Victoria Sterling watched from the observation deck, her arms crossed over her chest. At 35, she was the first woman to achieve company command at Vanguard, a position she'd fought for through years of being harder, faster, and colder than any of her male counterparts. She'd earned her nickname Ice Queen, not through cruelty, but through an absolute refusal to show weakness or ask for accommodation. When she saw Emma standing there with that rusted weapon, something like contempt flickered across her face. "This is exactly why integration policies fail," Sterling muttered to the officer beside her, Gunnery Sergeant Rick "Tex" Morrison, a weapons specialist who'd spent 18 years turning recruits into marksmen. "They lower the standards, pretend everything's equal, and then wonder why nobody takes it seriously." Morrison nodded, his weathered features settling into a frown. "That rifle hasn't been fired in probably 15 years. Probably shouldn't be fired at all. If it doesn't jam after 3 rounds, I'll be amazed." Down on the range, Emma raised her eyes to meet Brennan's directly for just a moment before dropping her gaze back to regulation neutrality. That brief contact carried something the sergeant major couldn't quite identify, and it irritated him more than open defiance would have. "You've got something to say, Hayes." "No, Sergeant Major." "Good, because actions speak louder than words, don't they?" He turned to address the formation. "Today's exercise, kill house compound clearance. Standard time limit is 8 minutes. Passing accuracy is 70%. I'm personally betting Hayes here doesn't hit 30%. He paused for effect. "Any takers willing to bet against me?" Silence answered him. Not one soldier stepped forward to defend the woman holding the rusted rifle. "Before we dive deeper into what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever been completely underestimated? Maybe at work, maybe at school, maybe in life. That moment when someone looks at you and decides you're not capable before you even get a chance to prove yourself. If you're nodding right now, hit that subscribe button, because this channel is dedicated to stories of people who turned underestimation into their greatest weapon. We bring you real stories of hidden excellence of quiet warriors who changed everything when no one was watching. Don't miss what happens next. Lieutenant Blake Cordova emerged from the equipment building carrying a standard ammunition belt, but something about his expression suggested calculation rather than routine procedure. At 28, he was the youngest officer to achieve his current position at Vanguard, a fact he attributed to natural leadership rather than the aggressive networking and political maneuvering that his peers whispered about behind his back. He approached Emma with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your ammunition, Private." He held out the belt, and Emma took it automatically, her fingers registering the weight before her conscious mind processed the information. 20 rounds. Standard load for this drill was 40. Half the ammunition she needed. "Sir," she began, then stopped. Challenging an officer's decision in front of 80 witnesses wasn't the move here. She clipped the belt to her gear and said nothing more. "Problem, Hayes." Cordova's smile widened. "Or are you going to claim you need special accommodation already?" "No problem, sir." "Excellent." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Hayes, just so you know, I've assigned you to Fire Team Delta. They're waiting for you by the armory." Fire Team Delta. Emma kept her expression neutral, but everyone on that range knew what Delta meant. It was where they put the soldiers who'd failed basic qualifications, the ones who were one mistake away from recycling or discharge. The reject squad. Being assigned there wasn't just an insult, it was a public announcement that she'd already been judged and found wanting. Private Danny Torres stood with 3 other soldiers near the armory, his young face a mixture of resignation and embarrassment. At 23, he'd already failed the advanced course twice, not for lack of effort, but for consistently crumbling under pressure when it mattered most. When he saw Emma approaching with the rusted M16, something like pity crossed his features. "Ma'am," he said quietly as she joined them. He wasn't supposed to call her ma'am. They were both privates, but there was an instinctive respect in the word that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than military protocol. "That rifle, it hasn't been fired in years. The firing pin might be broken." Emma turned the weapon over in her hands, her fingers moving along the receiver with a familiarity that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it. She pulled the charging handle back smoothly, checking the chamber in a motion so fluid it could have been mistaken for simple inspection rather than the practiced assessment of someone who'd handled thousands of weapons under conditions ranging from peacetime maintenance to active firefights. The bolt carrier moved with resistance, years of neglect, making it sticky, but it moved. "It's intact," she said, her voice soft. "Just needs cleaning." Torres looked at her with new interest. "You've worked with M16s before?" "Maybe." It was a nothing answer, perfectly non-committal, the kind of response that shut down questions without being overtly evasive. But the way her thumb had automatically checked the extractor, the way her eye had instantly aligned with the sight picture to verify true zero, the way her breathing had shifted into a particular rhythm without conscious thought, these were breadcrumbs scattered too subtly for most observers to collect. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, the base armorer, watched this interaction from his window 20 yards away. At 36, he'd seen thousands of soldiers handle weapons, and he could distinguish between someone who'd taken a basic familiarization course and someone who'd spent real-time downrange. The private holding that rusted rifle moved like the latter, but her service record showed standard training pipeline basic infantry school, then straight to Vanguard. Nothing exceptional. Nothing that explained the muscle memory he was witnessing. The march to the kill house compound took 15 minutes long enough for the desert sun to start its serious work. Heat rose in visible waves from the sand, and sweat began to darken the backs of uniforms. The compound itself was a permanent fixture at Vanguard, a maze of plywood walls and metal frames, designed to simulate urban combat environments with pop-up targets that could appear at any distance from 15 to 300 yards. It was where careers were made or broken, where the difference between competent soldiers and exceptional operators became unmistakable. The observation deck filled rapidly. 50-plus personnel crowded the elevated platform that provided clear sight lines into the compound. Major General Sarah Reeves had arrived exactly on schedule, her 2-star rank, making everyone stand a little straighter. At 52, she'd commanded combat operations for 15 years before moving into her current role overseeing training facilities, and she had a reputation for seeing through pretense to identify real capability. She positioned herself at the front of the deck, binoculars already in hand. "What's the situation, Sergeant Major?" Her voice carried the authority of someone who expected complete honesty, not filtered reports. Brennan snapped to attention. "Standard killhouse drill, ma'am. Testing the new private's capabilities under realistic conditions." Reeves studied the scene below. Emma checking her rifle, the reject squad looking nervous, the crowd of observers gathering like spectators at an execution. "That weapon looks like it belongs in a museum, not a live fire exercise." The private didn't object, ma'am. "I see." Reeves lifted her binoculars, focusing on Emma. For several seconds, she watched the way the young woman stood the particular distribution of weight on the balls of her feet, rather than flat-footed the scan pattern her eyes followed, while appearing to look at nothing in particular. Then she lowered the binoculars with an expression that revealed nothing. "Carry on." The betting pool started immediately. Sergeant First Class Deshaun Williams, the range safety officer, kept an informal tally on his tablet, $200 on Hayes failing completely, 80 on her managing to complete but missing accuracy standards, 20 on her passing but taking longer than regulation time, not $1 on her actually succeeding under the parameters set. Private Jake Bulldog Matthews, who'd earned his nickname through aggressive confrontation rather than any actual combat experience, leaned against the observation rail with a grin that showed too many teeth. "Hey, beauty queen," he called down. "Need someone to carry your purse while you're in there?" Laughter rippled through the observers. Emma didn't turn her head. She simply continued her weapon inspection, her fingers now working over the trigger mechanism, feeling for the resistance that would indicate whether the internal springs had degraded beyond function. The trigger broke clean at approximately 4.5 pounds, well within acceptable parameters, despite the external rust. Master Sergeant Owen Drake stood apart from the younger soldiers, his weathered face carrying the particular exhaustion that came from too many years seeing too much. At 45, he'd trained over 3,000 soldiers, and his time in Vietnam had given him perspectives the younger generation couldn't access. He watched Emma with the same detached assessment he'd learned to apply to every recruit. No expectations, no assumptions, just observation. "I've trained thousands," he said to Gunnery Sergeant Linda Cho, the female drill instructor, documenting the exercise with an official camera. "Women don't have the aggression trigger needed for combat shooting. They can qualify on a flat range, sure, but under pressure and chaos, they hesitate. It's biological, not personal." Cho kept filming without responding. She'd heard variations of this speech for the entire 8 years she'd been at Vanguard, and experience had taught her that arguing achieved nothing. Results spoke louder than debate. Lieutenant Cordova climbed onto the observation deck, his expression carefully neutral. He positioned himself where he could clearly see both the compound and General Reeves, a man always aware of who was watching. When Captain Sterling joined the observers, Cordova moved closer to her. "Captain, I've prepared secondary drills if this one proves inadequate," he said quietly. "We need comprehensive data for the evaluation reports." Sterling nodded once her ice-blue eyes fixed on Emma below. "Good thinking, though I doubt we'll need them. This will be over quickly." Down at the compound entrance, Emma clipped the ammunition belt to her gear and performed one final chamber check. 20 rounds for a drill designed for 40. The math was simple, but the implications more complex. She'd need to hit 70% accuracy, 14 targets minimum, with bullets to spare for the shots that would inevitably miss or need follow-up. No room for error, no second chances. The rejection of everything Brennan expected. The drill's buzzer system squawked to life, Cordova's voice emerging through the speakers with unnecessary volume. "Private Hayes, you have 8 minutes to clear the compound. Targets will appear at random intervals and distances. Hostile targets must be neutralized with center mass hits. Civilian targets must not be engaged. Your time begins in 30 seconds. Danny Torres and the other members of Fire Team Delta clustered near Emma, their nervousness palpable. They knew they were supposed to support her, but the situation felt impossible, designed for failure rather than success. "We're going to get destroyed," Torres whispered. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. We're not exactly the best backup you could have." Emma looked at him directly for the first time, and something in her gray-blue eyes made him stop talking. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something more like recognition, the kind of look that said she'd been exactly where he was standing, feeling exactly what he was feeling, and she'd found a way through to the other side. "Trust me," she said. 2 words, but they carried weight that simple encouragement shouldn't have. "Stay tight, watch your corners, and move when I move. We're going to be fine." The buzzer sounded. 8 minutes started counting down on the observation deck displays. Emma moved forward into the compound, her team following, and immediately she did something unexpected. She went left while standard doctrine dictated moving right. The choice seemed random to most observers, but those with tactical training recognized it immediately as the harder path, the one with less cover and worse sightlines. "She's going to get pinned in the first 30 seconds. Morrison muttered, his fingers drumming nervously against the rail. The first target popped at 50 yards, a hostile silhouette emerging from behind a plywood barrier. Emma's rifle came up smoothly, her stance perfect, despite the unfamiliar weapon. Her finger found the trigger, began the press, and the rifle jammed. The round chambered but failed to fire, a mechanical failure that sent a ripple of satisfied murmurs through the observation deck. Exactly what everyone had predicted, but Emma's response wasn't panic or frustration. Her hands moved through an immediate action drill with mechanical precision, tapped the magazine to ensure it was seated, racked the charging handle to clear the chamber, observed the ejected round, check for obstruction, reload. The entire sequence took 1.2 seconds faster than most soldiers could execute it with a functioning weapon, faster than the observers could process what they were seeing. The target was still visible. Emma fired. Center mass. Perfect hit. "Wait, what?" Matthews leaned forward, his grin faltering. "How did she—" A second target appeared at 100 yards, this one moving laterally across a gap between walls. Emma tracked it, her barrel moving with fluid patience, and fired during the exact moment when the target's momentum shifted direction. Another center mass hit. The murmurs on the observation deck changed tone slightly, uncertainty creeping into the dismissiveness. Webb the armorer lifted his own binoculars, studying Emma's technique with newfound focus. The way she was leading moving targets, the split-second adjustments she was making for distance and wind, the breathing pattern that synchronized with each trigger press. This wasn't basic marksmanship. This was something else entirely. A third target popped at 150 yards, partially obscured by a barrier that left maybe 6 inches of exposure. Standard doctrine said to wait for a better shot to conserve ammunition when the target was marginal. Emma waited 3 seconds, completely motionless, and then fired through the gap. The target went down. "That's advanced marksmanship," Morrison said, no longer trying to hide his surprise. He turned to look at Brennan, who stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable behind mirror sunglasses. "Where did she learn that?" Brennan said nothing, but his jaw was tight. 4 minutes and 37 seconds after entering the compound, Emma and her team emerged from the exit point. The drill's automatic scoring system displayed the results on every screen: 17 hits out of 18 rounds fired. Accuracy, 94%. 0 civilian targets engaged. Time elapsed 4 minutes, 37 seconds. Course record beaten by 3 minutes and 14 seconds. Silence fell across the observation deck like a physical weight. Then chaos. "No way," someone shouted. "That's impossible." "She got lucky," another voice insisted, already looking for explanations that preserved the existing worldview. "That rifle shouldn't even fire." "Run the numbers again," Matthews demanded, pointing at the scoring display. "There has to be an error." But the numbers didn't change. Emma Hayes, the diversity quota, the beauty queen, the private who wasn't supposed to last a week at Vanguard, had just demolished the facility's long-standing record with a weapon that should have been condemned years ago. General Reeves lowered her binoculars slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. She'd seen combat excellence before, had commanded operators who could perform under impossible conditions, and she recognized the particular quality of Emma's performance. It wasn't luck or adrenaline. It was trained competence, the kind that only came from repetition, measured in thousands of hours. Emma emerged from the compound and walked directly to Staff Sergeant Webb, extending the rusted M16 toward him. "Firing pin needs replacement," she said quietly. "Extractor spring is weak. Barrel has approximately 3 inches of fouling that should be removed before anyone else uses this weapon." Webb took the rifle automatically, his eyes widening as he processed her assessment. He'd been an armorer for 18 years, and his inspection protocol would have checked exactly those 3 systems. But Emma had identified the issues through feel alone, through the subtle variations in how the weapon cycled through degradations that shouldn't have been perceptible to someone firing it for the first time. "You're right on all 3, he said, turning the rifle over in his hands. "How did you know, without disassembling it?" Emma's answer was as minimal as everything else about her. "I could feel it." Then she walked away, leaving Webb staring after her with the kind of puzzlement that preceded fundamental reassessment. Captain Sterling descended from the observation deck, her heels striking the metal stairs with sharp precision. She'd built her entire career on being the exception, the woman who succeeded by being undeniably better than her male counterparts. Emma's performance threatened that narrative in ways Sterling was only beginning to understand. "Private Hayes," she called out, her voice carrying command authority. "Hold position." Emma stopped, turned, came to attention. "Ma'am." Sterling walked a slow circle around her, examining her uniform, her bearing, her expression. "You got lucky. One good run doesn't make you an operator." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Sterling moved closer, her voice dropping to something more personal than official. "There are people here who've spent years earning respect. You think you can show up and shortcut that process with one drill? No, ma'am." "Then what exactly do you think you proved today?" For a moment, Emma held Sterling's gaze directly, and something passed between them that was more complex than simple confrontation. Then Emma's eyes returned to regulation neutrality. "Nothing, ma'am, just completed the assigned task." It was the perfect answer, respectful, non-confrontational, impossible to criticize, and it frustrated Sterling more than defiance would have. She dismissed Emma with a gesture and returned to the observation deck, her mind already composing the report she'd file about today's events. Sergeant Major Brennan hadn't moved from his position. He stood like a monument to rigidity, watching Emma with an intensity that suggested he was trying to see through her skin to whatever was hiding underneath. When she walked past him toward the barracks, he finally spoke. "Hayes, my office. Now." They walked in silence across the compound, the afternoon heat building toward its peak. Brennan's office was a monument to military efficiency, clean desk regulation furnishings, walls covered with commendations and photographs from deployments spanning 3 decades. He closed the door and gestured for Emma to remain standing at attention. "Where did you train before this?" His voice was controlled but carried an edge that suggested the control required effort. "Basic training, then infantry school, then here, Sergeant Major, standard pipeline. Your file shows weapons qualification scores were mediocre at best. Now suddenly you're shooting expert plus." He pulled her service record from a drawer, flipping through pages that showed exactly what he'd described: adequate but unexceptional performance. "You want to explain that maybe I'm a late bloomer, Sergeant Major?" Brennan's fist came down on the desk, not hard enough to damage anything, but loud enough to make his point. "Don't play games with me, Private. I've been doing this for 23 years. I know the difference between natural talent and trained expertise. What you did today wasn't beginner's luck." Emma kept her eyes fixed on the wall behind his head, her expression revealing nothing. "I completed the assigned drill to Standard Sergeant Major. If there's another drill you'd like me to attempt, I'm ready." The words were correct, the tone appropriate, but something in the delivery made Brennan feel like he was the one being evaluated rather than conducting the evaluation. He studied her for a long moment, trying to find the crack that would let him see inside, but Emma Hayes presented a surface as smooth as polished steel. "Dismissed," he finally said. "But Private, this isn't over, not by a long shot." "Yes, Sergeant Major." Emma executed a perfect about-face and left her footsteps measured and unhurried. Brennan waited until she was gone before picking up his desk phone and dialing an internal extension. "Morrison, it's Brennan. I need you to design another drill, something harder. I want to see what happens when Hayes faces a real challenge." Whatever response Morrison gave made Brennan nod with satisfaction. "Good. Set it up for tomorrow morning. And Morrison, make it something she can't possibly prepare for." Outside, Emma walked back toward the barracks where Fire Team Delta was celebrating their unexpected success with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested they still couldn't quite believe what had happened. Danny Torres saw her approaching and jogged over his face, split by a grin. "Ma'am, that was incredible. How did you—" "It was a team effort," Emma interrupted gently. "You all did exactly what you needed to do. But the shots, the timing, the way you handled that jam—" Torres trailed off, looking at her with an expression that mixed admiration and confusion. "Have you done this before, like in combat or something?" Emma's answer was the same non-answer she'd given Webb and Brennan. "I just follow training protocol, same as everyone else." But her hands, as she spoke, moved through an unconscious sequence, adjusting her belt at exactly the point where a tactical vest would sit her weight, shifting into the balanced stance that combat veterans adopted, without thinking, her eyes performing a constant scan pattern that mapped exits and threats and tactical advantages. These were breadcrumbs scattered by muscle memory that couldn't be completely suppressed, visible to anyone who knew what they were looking for. Staff Sergeant Webb was one of those people. He'd followed Emma from the range to observe her interactions with her team, and what he saw confirmed his growing suspicion that Private Hayes was something more than her service record suggested. The way she moved through space, the way she positioned herself to maintain situational awareness, the way her hands never strayed far from positions where weapons would typically be carried, these weren't behaviors taught in basic infantry training. These were combat reflexes worn so deep they'd become automatic. He made a note to himself to review her file more carefully. Something didn't add up, and in his experience, when service records and observed behavior contradicted each other, the explanation was usually either fraud or classification. He suspected the latter. The rest of the afternoon passed in deceptive calm. Emma completed her assigned duties with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her entire time at Vanguard, cleaning weapons, maintaining equipment, studying tactical manuals that most soldiers skimmed rather than memorized. But word of her kill house performance spread through the base like wildfire, carried by the 80 witnesses who'd watched from the observation deck. By dinner time, everyone at Vanguard had heard some version of the story. The details morphed. With each retelling, the rifle was even rustier, the targets were harder, the time was even faster, but the core remained consistent. The quiet private everyone had dismissed had just embarrassed the facility's best scores. Private Alex Chen, a tech-savvy recruit with a gift for pattern recognition, spent his evening studying footage from the kill house cameras. The security system recorded everything for training analysis, and Chen had access through his assignment to the communications section. What he saw on the screen made him pause the footage and rewind 3 times, trying to match what he was seeing with what he knew about standard infantry doctrine. Emma's footwork was wrong. Not incorrect wrong in the sense that it didn't match what was taught in basic training. It was tighter, more economical, with specific angle approaches that optimized for speed and protection in ways that standard doctrine sacrificed for simplicity. Chen had seen this footwork before briefly in a classified training video he'd accidentally accessed while setting up a system upgrade. The video had been labeled Tier 1 CQB Doctrine and had been removed from the server within hours. He made a note to himself and said nothing to anyone, but his eyes followed Emma differently after that, with the particular attention of someone who'd glimpsed a pattern they couldn't yet explain. Night fell across Vanguard with the suddenness typical of the desert temperature dropping 20 degrees in the first hour after sunset. Emma sat alone in the barracks common area, cleaning the rifle she'd been issued to replace the rusted M16. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, each motion economical and precise, and she worked in complete silence while other soldiers laughed and talked around her. Private Maria Gonzalez, one of 3 female recruits in the current training cycle, watched Emma from across the room with barely concealed curiosity. At 21, Gonzalez had spent her entire time at Vanguard trying to prove she belonged, trying to be tough enough and fast enough and good enough to earn respect from men who started from the assumption that she'd fail. Seeing Emma succeed so completely had created something like hope in Gonzalez's chest, though she wasn't quite sure what to do with the feeling. Finally, she worked up the courage to approach. "Private Hayes." Emma looked up, her expression neutral. "Gonzalez, I just wanted to say, what you did today was amazing." The words came out rushed, genuine. "I've never seen anyone shoot like that. How did you learn practice? One word, nothing more. But something in Emma's eyes suggested depth beneath the simple answer layers of experience and training and time that a single word couldn't contain. Gonzalez waited for elaboration that never came. "Could you maybe show me sometime? Some of what you know." Gonzalez's voice carried hope and vulnerability in equal measure. "I'm trying to qualify expert before the end of cycle, and I could really use—" "The range opens at 0600, Emma said. "If you're there, I'll show you." It wasn't enthusiasm or warm encouragement, but it was yes, and that was enough. Gonzalez thanked her and retreated, feeling like she'd just received something more valuable than she could immediately quantify. Emma returned to her weapon cleaning, but her mind was working through calculations that had nothing to do with rifle maintenance. Today's performance had been necessary but dangerous, a forced revelation that compromised the anonymity she'd maintained for 3 weeks. She'd come to Vanguard for specific reasons, and drawing attention to herself made those reasons harder to accomplish. But the alternative, deliberately failing the drill, would have been worse. It would have validated every dismissive assumption, confirmed every bias, and more importantly, it would have been dishonest in a way that violated something fundamental in Emma Hayes. Whatever else she was, whatever other deceptions she maintained, she couldn't bring herself to pretend to be less competent than she actually was. Not when it mattered, not when people were watching. So she'd perform to standard, and now she'd deal with the consequences. The attention would be manageable, the questions would be deflected, and the mission would continue even if the parameters had shifted slightly. Lieutenant Cordova sat in his private quarters, staring at a laptop screen that showed information that wasn't officially accessible to someone at his rank. His security clearance allowed him to view basic service records, but what he was looking at now required access to classified databases that he'd obtained through connections he was careful never to discuss openly. Emma Hayes' official file was exactly as Brennan had described: standard recruitment, standard training, standard qualifications. But there were gaps in the timeline that didn't quite make sense, periods of several months labeled simply as training, with no additional details. He'd seen gaps like this before in the files of soldiers who'd done work that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The 7-month disappearance during what should have been advanced infantry training, the lack of specific unit assignments during key periods, the medical records that referenced injuries without explaining how they'd been sustained. These were red flags that suggested Emma Hayes had been doing something other than what her official record claimed. Cordova made a decision. Tomorrow morning, he'd submit a request for expanded background verification through channels that would take several days to process, but would eventually reveal whatever was being hidden. If Hayes was exactly what she appeared to be, an exceptionally talented soldier who'd somehow escaped earlier notice, then the verification would confirm it and he could adjust his approach accordingly. But if she was something else, something that might complicate his own carefully constructed position at Vanguard, then he needed to know before things progressed further. He drafted the request, encrypted it properly, and sent it through the system. Then he closed the laptop and allowed himself a smile. Whatever Emma Hayes was hiding, he'd know soon enough. And knowledge in his experience was the most valuable currency in any organization. Miles away from Vanguard, in an office building that officially didn't exist, Colonel Raymond Pierce reviewed the same security footage that Alex Chen had studied. Pierce's clearance level was considerably higher than a corporal's, and his access to classified information was essentially unlimited within his operational sphere. He'd been tracking Emma Hayes since her arrival at Vanguard, not because she'd done anything to warrant investigation, but because her name had triggered an automated alert in a system that monitored thousands of potential security concerns. The alert was simple. Emma Hayes, supposedly a standard infantry private, was using movement patterns and techniques that matched Tier 1 operational doctrine. The system had flagged 14 specific instances over her 3 weeks at Vanguard, each one subtle enough to escape human notice, but distinct enough to register on algorithmic pattern matching. Pierce had served alongside Task Force Black operators during his deployment to Fallujah. He'd seen them work, studied their methods, and learned to recognize the particular way they moved through space and engaged with threats. What he was watching on this security footage looked exactly like that, which meant Emma Hayes was either an extraordinarily gifted imposter or she was exactly who the system thought she might be. He picked up a secure phone and dialed a number that connected to an office where phones didn't ring. They simply displayed incoming calls on silent screens for people to notice when they were ready. "This is Pierce. I need verification on a name Emma Hayes, currently assigned to Forward Operating Base Vanguard. Cross-reference with Task Force Black personnel records." The response took 30 seconds, which was fast by the standards of classified verification. When the voice returned, it carried a weight that confirmed Pierce's suspicion. That name is flagged at Level 7 classification. No information available without direct authorization from JSOC Command. Level 7. Pierce thanked the voice and disconnected. There were only 5 levels of standard classification in the military, which meant Emma Hayes wasn't just classified, she was deep black part of operations that officially never happened, conducted by units that officially didn't exist. He made another note to himself and continued watching the footage. Whatever Emma Hayes was doing at Vanguard, it wasn't standard training. It was something else, something that Level 7 classification protected. And Pierce, despite his high clearance and extensive experience, knew better than to dig deeper without authorization. Some secrets stayed secret for very good reasons. Back at Vanguard, Emma finally finished her weapon maintenance and returned to her bunk. The barracks were quiet now, most soldiers already asleep in preparation for the 0500 wake-up that would come regardless of how tired they were. She lay in the darkness staring at the ceiling and allowed herself to think through everything that had happened today. The drill had gone exactly as she'd anticipated. Brennan's attempt to humiliate her had backfired, but the real success wasn't the performance itself. It was that she'd maintained her cover while demonstrating enough competence to explain any future excellence that might become necessary. The line she walked was razor-thin too much skill, and she'd blow her cover completely too little, and she'd fail to accomplish the actual mission that had brought her to Vanguard in the first place. That mission was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Identify the security leak that was feeding classified training information to hostile intelligence services. For the past 3 weeks, she'd been monitoring communications, observing personnel mapping relationships and access patterns. The leak was here at Vanguard, and it was someone with sufficient clearance and opportunity to compromise operational planning. Lieutenant Cordova was her primary suspect, but she didn't have proof yet. Just patterns, correlations, the kind of circumstantial evidence that would never hold up in a military tribunal. She needed something concrete, and that meant staying in position long enough to catch him in the act. Today's performance had complicated that timeline. Tomorrow would bring increased scrutiny, more questions, possibly background checks that could reveal things she needed to keep hidden. She'd have to be more careful, more controlled, more perfectly ordinary in every way that didn't absolutely require excellence. Her fingers unconsciously traced the edge of the tattoo on her lower back, the geometric pattern that carried meanings only a handful of people alive could fully interpret. Task Force Black had been disbanded 3 years ago after the Syria operation went catastrophically wrong. Officially, every member of the unit had been killed in action. Unofficially, Emma had survived, been pulled from the rubble of a compound that was supposed to have been empty, and spent 6 months recovering from injuries that should have been fatal. When she'd healed enough to function, she'd made a choice: stay dead and hunt the people who'd betrayed her unit, or return to official service and spend the rest of her career answering questions about operations she wasn't authorized to discuss. She'd chosen the first option, and for 3 years she'd been a ghost operating through false identities and unofficial channels, following a trail of corruption that led through military installations and defense contractors and levels of command that should have been trustworthy. The trail had led her here to Vanguard, to this bunk, to the moment when maintaining her cover required demonstrating skills she'd spent 3 years trying to hide. The contradiction was ironic enough to make her smile in the darkness. She'd become invisible by being too visible to ignore, had maintained her secret by showing just enough truth to explain the lies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow would require new calculations. But for tonight, Emma Hayes allowed herself to rest in the knowledge that she'd cleared one obstacle and positioned herself for the next phase. Outside, under a desert sky scattered with stars too numerous to count, forward operating base Vanguard slept. But in offices and barracks and secure facilities, people were thinking about Private Emma Hayes with varying levels of interest and concern. Some saw a threat, some saw a mystery, and one person somewhere in this facility saw a problem that needed to be eliminated before she could expose truths that were meant to stay buried. The next morning would bring all of these concerns into collision, and Emma would be ready. Dawn arrived at 0530 with the mechanical precision of military routine. Emma was already awake, had been for an hour, running through mental preparations while the barracks slowly stirred to life around her. She'd learned long ago that sleep was a luxury to be managed rather than a necessity to be indulged. and 4 hours was sufficient when properly trained. Private Maria Gonzalez appeared at the range at 0600 exactly as promised. Emma was already there, having used the previous 30 minutes to set up targets at varying distances and check the condition of the training ammunition. When Gonzalez approached slightly breathless from her jog across the compound, Emma simply handed her a rifle and pointed to the first firing position. "Stance first," Emma said. "Everything else builds from foundation." For the next hour, she walked Gonzalez through fundamentals that most instructors covered in minutes, but Emma broke down into components: foot placement relative to target direction, hip rotation for recoil management, shoulder pocket positioning to maintain sight picture through multiple shots. She spoke in short, precise sentences, demonstrating rather than lecturing, and Gonzalez absorbed the information with visible hunger. By 0700, Gonzalez was hitting targets at 150 yards, with consistency she'd never achieved before. Not perfection that would take months, but improvement dramatic enough to be unmistakable. "How do you know all this?" Gonzalez finally asked during a reload. "They didn't teach us this level of detail in basic." Emma's answer was characteristically minimal. "Different instructors teach different methods. Find what works for you." But the way she'd broken down each skill, the specific language she'd used to describe proper technique, the small adjustments she'd made to Gonzalez's grip and stance, these suggested teaching experience that went far beyond peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. This was instructor-level expertise, the kind developed through formal training programs and hundreds of hours working with students. Gunnery Sergeant Morrison arrived at the range at 0715 for his regular morning inspection and stopped short when he saw Emma working with Gonzalez. He watched for several minutes, his experienced eye analyzing the instruction being provided. What he witnessed bothered him in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. Private Hayes was teaching advanced marksmanship theory that Morrison himself had only learned during his specialized weapons instructor course at Quantico. When the session ended and Gonzalez departed with visible excitement, Morrison approached Emma directly. "Private Hayes, I need you to demonstrate something for me." Emma came to attention automatically. "Yes, Gunny." Morrison pulled a rifle from the range equipment locker. Not the rusted M16 from yesterday, but a standard issue weapon in good condition and a folded strip of cloth from his pocket. "I want you to field strip this rifle completely, then reassemble it, blindfolded." It was a challenge designed to be nearly impossible. Even experienced armorers took 3 to 4 minutes to disassemble and rebuild an M16 without vision, relying entirely on tactile feedback and muscle memory. For a private with supposedly standard training, the task should be beyond capability. Emma accepted the cloth without hesitation and tied it around her eyes with hands that showed no tremor. Then she picked up the rifle and began. Her fingers moved with surgical precision, finding pins and springs and components through touch alone. She worked in complete silence, no wasted motion, no hesitation, each movement flowing directly into the next, as though she'd performed this exact sequence thousands of times. The rifle came apart in her hands like a puzzle she'd solved so many times it had become meditation rather than challenge. 38 seconds. The completely disassembled weapon lay on the table before her in perfect organizational order. Receiver, bolt carrier, firing pin, cam, pin, charging handle buffer, spring trigger assembly, magazine release, each component positioned exactly where an armorer would place it for inspection. Morrison checked his stopwatch twice, certain he'd misread it. 38 seconds was faster than he could have managed it, faster than most of his specialized instructors could have managed it. It was the kind of speed that suggested this private had built and rebuilt rifles so many times that her hands knew the process better than her conscious mind. How? Morrison's question came out sharper than he'd intended. How is that possible? Emma removed the blindfold and began reassembling the weapon, her movements now visible but no less efficient. "Practice, Gunny. Nobody gets that fast with practice alone. That's thousands of repetitions. When did you log that kind of time?" The rifle clicked together with mechanical finality. Emma performed a function check, verified the weapon was properly assembled, and handed it back to Morrison. "Permission to return to my duties, Gunny." Morrison wanted to press, to demand answers that made sense of what he'd just witnessed. But something in Emma's stance reminded him of operators he'd worked with during his deployment to Afghanistan, soldiers who didn't explain themselves because their work was classified at levels that made explanation illegal. He made a decision that would haunt him later. He let her go. Dismiss private, but Hayes, we're going to talk about this again. Yes, Gunny. Emma walked away, leaving Morrison holding a rifle and a growing certainty that Private Hayes was not remotely what her service record suggested. He pulled out his phone and made a call he'd been considering since yesterday. Webb, it's Morrison. That private from yesterday. Hayes, I just watched her field strip a rifle blindfolded in 38 seconds. We need to talk. The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes and ended with both men agreeing to share their observations with higher command. Something was wrong with the official story, and wrong in a way that suggested either fraud or classification. Given the competence they'd witnessed, classification seemed more likely. The morning progressed through standard training evolutions, physical conditioning, tactical lectures, equipment maintenance. Emma participated with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her previous 3 weeks at Vanguard, drawing no additional attention to herself, answering questions with minimal words, existing in the careful space between competence and excellence. But eyes followed her now. Danny Torres watched her during formation with barely concealed curiosity. Alex Chen studied her movement patterns during the tactical exercise. Captain Voss, the physician assistant, made a note to review her medical records during his lunch break, and Colonel Pierce, watching via security cameras from his office 300 miles away, continued compiling evidence that would eventually require official action. At 1300 hours, Lieutenant Cordova received a response to his background verification request. The message was brief and deeply unsettling. Request denied. Subject file classified level 7. No access authorized without JSOC approval. Further inquiries will be logged and investigated. Level 7, classification. Cordova sat back in his chair, his mind racing through implications. He'd submitted background checks on hundreds of soldiers over his career, and he'd never once encountered a Level 7 denial. Standard classified operations were Level 3 or 4. Even most special operations work was Level 5. Level 7 meant black budget deniable operations units that officially didn't exist, which meant Private Emma Hayes was either the most successful imposter in military history, or she was something so classified that her mere presence at Vanguard represented operational security concern. Cordova made a decision that would prove to be catastrophically poor judgment. He decided to confront Emma directly to force the issue before higher command became involved. If she was legitimate, she'd have authorization to reveal herself when pressed. If she was fraud, he'd expose her and claim credit for identifying the security breach. He found her at 14:30 hours during the afternoon equipment inspection, working alone in the armory while other soldiers took their scheduled break. The room was quiet, filled with the smell of gun oil and metal, isolated enough for private conversation. Private Hayes, we need to talk. Emma looked up from the rifle she was cleaning, her expression neutral. Sir, Cordova closed the door behind him, a gesture that immediately changed the dynamic from public interaction to private confrontation. I ran your background verification. Do you know what I found? No, sir. I found nothing. Or rather, I found that your file is classified at a level I've never encountered before. He moved closer, invading her personal space in a way designed to intimidate. So here's what I think: either you're impersonating someone with classified background, which is federal crime, or you're here under false pretenses for reasons you haven't disclosed. Either way, I want answers. Now. Emma stood, slowly setting down her cleaning cloth with deliberate care. Sir, my service record is accurate. If you have concerns about classification levels, that's above my authority to address. Don't play games with me, Private. Cordova's voice rose slightly. I've been at Vanguard for 3 years. I know every soldier who comes through here, and you're not standard infantry. You're something else. So you're going to tell me exactly what you're doing here, or I'm going to make your life very difficult. It was a threat that might have worked on an actual private, someone vulnerable to officer authority and career consequences. But Emma Hayes was neither of those things, and her response carried a subtle shift in tone that Cordova registered too late. Lieutenant, I suggest you step back and reconsider this conversation. I don't take suggestions from privates. He reached out to grab her arm, intending to physically emphasize his authority. What happened next occurred too fast for Cordova to fully process. Emma's hand moved in a blur, redirecting his grab into a joint lock that put immediate pressure on his elbow and shoulder. Not enough to injure, she had perfect control, but enough to make movement impossible without pain. Then she released him just as quickly and stepped back, returning to parade rest, as though nothing had happened. Sir, I recommend you leave. Cordova stared at her, his arm throbbing, his pride injured more than his body. The technique she'd just used wasn't taught in basic combatives training. It was advanced hand-to-hand combat, the kind taught to special operations personnel for close-quarters threat neutralization. "You just assaulted an officer," he said, but his voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. "I defended myself against unauthorized physical contact, sir. There's a difference." Emma's tone remained perfectly respectful, perfectly regulation, but the message underneath was clear. She wasn't playing by the same rules he thought governed this interaction. Cordova backed toward the door, his mind already working through how to spin this incident to his advantage. "This isn't over, Hayes. Not by a long shot." He left, and Emma returned to cleaning her rifle. But her hands, steady throughout the confrontation, trembled slightly now that she was alone. Cordova's background check had triggered exactly the kind of attention she'd hoped to avoid, and his confrontation suggested he'd keep pushing until something broke. The timeline had just accelerated. Speaking of equipment that performs when it matters most, military-grade technology has evolved dramatically from those rusty M16s. Modern operators now rely on advanced tactical communication systems with encrypted channels, ruggedized tablets that function in extreme temperatures from -40 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and night vision optics with thermal imaging capabilities that can identify targets at over 2,000 yards. The difference between outdated gear and cutting-edge technology can mean the difference between mission success and failure. When your life depends on your equipment, settling for good enough isn't an option. These specialized systems undergo rigorous testing in conditions far harsher than any civilian device would ever face. If you're feeling that tension building right now, wondering how this is all going to unfold, you're exactly where I want you to be. This story is about to take a turn that will leave everyone speechless. Make sure you're subscribed because we're just getting started. The best part, you haven't seen anything yet. What's coming next will blow your mind. By 1600 hours, word of Cordova's confrontation with Emma had spread through informal channels. Details were vague, the armory had no security cameras, and neither participant was talking, but the fact that something significant had occurred was confirmed by Cordova's visible agitation and Emma's continued calm. Sergeant Major Brennan called an emergency formation at 1700 hours. All personnel from the advanced training cycle assembled in the main compound, 80-plus soldiers standing in perfect rows under the late afternoon sun. General Reeves stood on the observation deck, her presence transforming what would normally be a routine assembly into something far more significant. "Listen up," Brennan announced, his voice carrying across the formation. "Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours, we're conducting a final evaluation exercise. This will be the most challenging drill you've faced at Vanguard. Live fire complex scenario, multiple objectives. Performance on this exercise will determine your placement for the next phase of training." He paused, his eyes scanning the formation until they found Emma. "And to make things interesting, we're implementing something new, competitive team dynamics. Your performance will be evaluated not just on individual metrics, but on how you respond when competing directly against other teams for limited resources and time-sensitive objectives." It was deliberate targeting, another attempt to create conditions where Emma would either fail or reveal more of what she was hiding. Morrison, standing near Brennan, shifted uncomfortably. The parameters Brennan was describing violated standard training doctrine that emphasized cooperation over competition. Master Sergeant Drake, watching from his position near the rear of the formation, recognized the setup immediately. He'd seen variations of this during his own career, commanders creating impossible situations to justify predetermined conclusions. If Hayes failed tomorrow, Brennan could claim she'd only succeeded before through luck. If she succeeded, he'd escalate further until something broke. The formation was dismissed, but the tension remained. Soldiers dispersed to prepare equipment and study tactical scenarios, their conversations filled with speculation about tomorrow's exercise. Emma returned to the armory to conduct final maintenance on her assigned weapon. She worked alone as usual, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind calculated probabilities and contingencies. Cordova's confrontation had revealed the investigation into her background, which meant her cover was deteriorating faster than anticipated. Tomorrow's exercise would accelerate that deterioration further, forcing her to choose between maintaining pretense and completing her actual mission. The choice was already made. She'd come to Vanguard to identify the security leak, and all evidence pointed to Cordova. But she needed proof, concrete evidence that would hold up under official scrutiny, and that meant staying in position long enough to catch him in the act of transmitting classified information. She checked her weapon one final time, then secured it in the armory rack. As she turned to leave, Master Chief Harrison was standing in the doorway, having entered so quietly she hadn't heard him approach. That alone was significant. Very few people could surprise Emma Hayes. Private Hayes. Harrison said, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who knows they're about to have a conversation that can't be official. Or should I use your actual rank? Emma remained motionless, calculating the implications of this confrontation. Harrison was Navy SEAL, which meant his clearance level likely gave him access to information that most Army personnel couldn't access. If he knew who she really was, that changed the operational parameters significantly. I'm not sure what you mean, Master Chief. Harrison smiled slightly. I served alongside Task Force Black operators in Ramadi 2007. Watched them work, learned their patterns. You move exactly like they did. Same footwork, same weapon transitions, same threat assessment patterns. He paused. There are maybe 200 people alive who move like that. Most of them are still actively deployed. A few are dead. And one or two are doing exactly what you're doing, operating undercover for reasons that stay classified. Emma made a decision. Harrison was either part of the problem or part of the solution, and she needed to know which. If you're right about any of that, Master Chief, then you'd also know I can't confirm or deny anything you just said. I'm not asking you to confirm anything. I'm telling you that I recognize what you are, and I'm offering support if you need it. No questions, no reports, no complications. His expression was serious now. But I'm also warning you, whatever you're doing here, it's attracting attention from people who shouldn't be noticing you. Lieutenant Cordova filed an incident report about your confrontation this afternoon. He's making noise about security concerns and unauthorized combat training. That was faster than Emma had anticipated. Thank you for the warning, Master Chief. One more thing. Harrison reached into his pocket and pulled out a challenge coin, a small metal disc that military units use to recognize membership or achievement. This one bore no unit designation, just a simple geometric pattern that Emma recognized immediately. I earned this in Ramadi. The operator who gave it to me said only give it to someone who understands what it means. He held it out. I think you understand. Emma took the coin, feeling the weight of it in her palm. The geometric pattern matched the tattoo hidden beneath her uniform, the mark of Task Force Black operators. I'll keep it safe, Master Chief. Harrison nodded and left without another word. Emma stood alone in the armory, holding a piece of metal that represented both recognition and warning. Her cover was thoroughly compromised, now visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Tomorrow's exercise would likely force complete revelation. She pocketed the coin and returned to the barracks to prepare for what would come. Night fell with its usual desert abruptness. Most soldiers slept fitfully nervous about tomorrow's evaluation. Emma didn't sleep at all. Instead, she used the darkness to access areas of the base that would be difficult to explain during daylight hours. At 0230 hours, she entered the communications building through a maintenance entrance that should have been locked but wasn't a security vulnerability she'd identified during her first week at Vanguard. The building housed secure servers and transmission equipment, and more importantly, it housed activity logs that recorded every classified communication sent from the base. Emma had legitimate access to some of these systems through her official duties, but what she needed tonight required privileges several levels above a private's authorization. She'd been slowly accumulating access credentials over the past 3 weeks, piecing together passwords and security tokens from careless personnel and poorly secured workstations. 20 minutes of careful work gave her what she needed: transmission logs showing that Lieutenant Cordova had been sending encrypted messages to an external address that, when traced through multiple proxies, terminated at a server associated with a private military contractor known to have connections to hostile intelligence services. The messages themselves were encrypted, but the pattern was unmistakable every time Vanguard conducted advanced training exercises. Cordova sent transmissions within 12 hours. He was feeding tactical information to someone outside the military command structure, exactly the security leak Emma had been sent to identify. She documented everything with her phone camera, careful to include timestamps and authentication codes that would verify the evidence's legitimacy. Then she erased all traces of her access and departed the communications building as quietly as she'd entered. Mission accomplished. She had the proof she needed. Now she just had to survive tomorrow's exercise long enough to deliver it to proper authorities. 0800 hours arrived with Sergeant Major Brennan's voice booming across the assembly area. Form up, we're burning daylight. The final evaluation exercise was even more complex than anyone had anticipated. Teams of 4 would compete to complete a live fire scenario that required breaching a fortified compound, extracting a simulated hostage, and evacuating under simulated enemy fire from multiple positions. Resources were deliberately limited, ammunition time and support assets all rationed to create pressure. Emma was assigned to Fire Team Delta, again the reject squad, but this time paired with a twist. They'd be competing directly against Fire Team Alpha, led by Private Matthews, the same soldier who'd mocked her as Beauty Queen during their first encounter. The observation deck was more crowded than Emma had ever seen it. General Reeves occupied the prime viewing position, but she was joined now by officers Emma didn't recognize, senior personnel from other facilities, who'd apparently been invited specifically to observe this exercise. Colonel Pierce was among them, having traveled from his distant office to witness in person what he'd been tracking via security feeds. When his eyes found Emma, he nodded once, a gesture so subtle that only someone watching for it would notice. The exercise began with both teams entering the compound from opposite sides. Standard doctrine would have suggested cooperation, but Brennan had specifically designed the parameters to force competition. Only one team could successfully extract the hostage within the time limit. Matthews's team moved with aggressive confidence, their approach loud and direct. They'd trained under Brennan's old-school methods: overwhelming force, maximum aggression, assumed dominance through superior violence of action. Emma's team moved like ghosts. She'd spent the previous night briefing Torres Chen and their other teammate on specific tactics that weren't taught in standard infantry doctrine. They approached through angles that standard training would consider non-optimal, but that provided superior cover and concealment. Their movement was slower, but infinitely more controlled. The first obstacles were automated pop-up targets designed to simulate enemy sentries. Matthews's team engaged immediately, their rifle fire echoing across the compound. They hit their targets but used excessive ammunition, doing so rounds wasted through rapid fire rather than controlled pairs. Emma's team waited. She'd identified something the others had missed. The automated targets appeared in patterns, not random sequences. By waiting 7 seconds, her team could engage during a gap in the appearance sequence and advance, while Matthews's team was still suppressing their sector. Morrison, watching from the observation deck, leaned forward. "She's reading the pattern." "How is she reading the pattern?" "We randomized the sequence." "It's not random," Webb said quietly beside him. "Look at the timing intervals. There's a 3-second processing lag in the system between target sets. Someone who's trained to read mechanical patterns would catch it." "Someone who's trained to read mechanical patterns," Morrison repeated slowly. "That's not infantry training. That's intelligence analysis, threat assessment protocol." On the observation deck, the unidentified senior officers were taking notes with expressions that suggested they were seeing exactly what they'd come to observe. Emma's team reached the hostage location first, using their conserved ammunition and tactical positioning to outmaneuver Matthews's more aggressive approach. But the extraction presented a new problem. The hostage was a dummy weighted to simulate a wounded soldier, and the evacuation route required carrying 200 pounds through 200 yards of compound terrain while under simulated fire from multiple directions. Standard procedure called for 2-person carries, but that would leave only 2 team members to provide covering fire, insufficient, given the simulated threat density. Emma made a decision that would later be analyzed in training doctrine revisions. She created a modified diamond formation where 3 team members rotated through covering positions, while the 4th her carried the hostage alone. "That's impossible," Brennan said flatly, watching the tactical display. "A 1-person carry of that weight over that distance while maintaining situational awareness, she'll collapse halfway through." But Emma didn't collapse. Her movement wasn't fast, but it was consistent, and her positioning kept her protected behind her team's suppressive fire. More importantly, her breathing never shifted from the controlled rhythm that marked experienced operators under stress. She wasn't straining. She was executing. Matthews's team reached the extraction point 10 seconds before Emma's team, but they'd used all their ammunition and half their members had been killed by hostile pop-ups they'd failed to properly clear. According to the scoring system, they'd failed the mission despite reaching the objective first. Emma's team completed the extraction with 0 casualties, 15 rounds remaining, and a time that beat the facility's previous record by 42 seconds. Silence fell across the observation deck, then chaos. "Explain that," one of the unidentified officers demanded, pointing at the tactical display. "Explain how a standard infantry private just executed advanced special operations extraction protocol." Brennan had no explanation. Morrison had no explanation. The only people who weren't surprised were Colonel Pierce and Master Chief Harrison, both of whom watched with expressions that suggested they'd expected exactly this outcome. General Reeves descended from the observation deck with deliberate purpose, her boots striking each stair with finality. The crowd of observers parted automatically as she made her way toward the compound exit where Emma's team was emerging. "Private Hayes, remain in position. The rest of you dismissed." Torres Chen and the other team member departed reluctantly, leaving Emma standing alone at attention, still carrying the 200-pound dummy across her shoulders as though it weighed nothing. "Put that down, Private." Emma lowered the dummy with perfect control, no dropping or collapsing, just smooth descent until it rested on the ground. Then she returned to attention, her breathing still perfectly regulated, despite having just completed what should have been an exhausting physical effort. "Where did you learn those tactics?" Reeves asked directly, no preamble or diplomatic phrasing. "Standard infantry doctrine, ma'am." "Don't insult my intelligence, Private. I've commanded combat operations for 15 years. What you just demonstrated was Tier 1 Special Operations Extraction Protocol. So I'll ask again, where did you learn it?" Emma met Reeves's eyes, directly a break from the downcast regulation gaze she'd maintained for 3 weeks. "Ma'am, I'm not authorized to answer that question." The phrasing was critical, not, "I don't know," or "I can't remember," but specifically "not authorized," a phrase that carried very different implications. Reeves studied her for a long moment, then pulled out her phone and made a call. "This is Major General Reeves, Vanguard. I need immediate verification on Private Emma Hayes, currently assigned to my facility. Cross-reference with, yes, use whatever access you need. I'll wait." The conversation lasted 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes contained multiple moments where Reeves's expression shifted from certainty to confusion to something approaching shock. When she finally disconnected, she looked at Emma with completely different eyes. "Lieutenant Hayes, attention." Emma's posture shifted subtly but unmistakably from private to officer bearing. The change was so natural that it suggested the previous 3 weeks of subordinate behavior had been the performance, not this moment of revealed authority. "Lieutenant Commander Cordova has been detained," Reeves continued. "Military intelligence received evidence approximately 0630 this morning of security breaches traced to his communications. I assume you know something about that evidence." "Yes, ma'am." "And your presence at Vanguard in operational assignment, ma'am, classified under Joint Special Operations Command Authority." Reeves nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "Lieutenant Emma Hayes, Task Force Black, officially killed in action 3 years ago in Syria." The words carried across the now silent range. Soldiers who'd been preparing for their own training evolutions stopped and stared. Officers on the observation deck froze mid-conversation. 80 witnesses heard the revelation simultaneously, and the implications spread like shockwaves through water. Brennan descended the observation deck stairs so fast he nearly tripped, his face contorted with disbelief and anger, and something that might have been fear. "That's impossible." Task Force Black was completely eliminated. Every operator confirmed killed. "Not every operator," Colonel Pierce said, stepping forward to stand beside Reeves. "One survived. One was pulled from a compound that should have been empty but turned out to be a trap. One spent 6 months recovering from injuries that included 3 bullet wounds, a collapsed lung, and fractures to 14 bones." He looked at Emma. "One came back from the dead to hunt the people who'd betrayed her unit." Emma remained at attention, saying nothing, confirming nothing, but her silence carried more weight than any verbal confirmation could have. "Show them," Pierce said quietly. "They've earned the truth." Emma hesitated for only a moment, then she reached back and lifted the edge of her uniform shirt, exposing her lower back. The tattoo was exactly as described in her file, a geometric eagle pattern in black ink wings spread 6 inches across her spine, talons gripping a shield bearing 3 stars numbers embedded within the design, TF Black 072, and below it all, in small precise letters, her call sign, Phantom. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person on that range moved or spoke for 3 full seconds, an eternity in military time. Then, Master Sergeant Drake, standing near the back of the crowd, removed his cover and held it over his heart. I served with black operators in Kandahar 2008. Lost 3 friends there. They saved my entire unit during an ambush we shouldn't have survived. His voice carried across the silence. Ma'am, it's an honor. The gesture broke the paralysis. One by one, officers and enlisted personnel throughout the range came to attention. Colonel Pierce raised his hand in formal salute, followed by Morrison Webb and dozens of others. Even Brennan, despite his visible struggle with the revelation, eventually brought his hand up in recognition of what Emma represented. General Reeves returned the salute with precision that carried 30 years of military service. At ease, Lieutenant Hayes. Emma lowered her shirt and returned to parade rest, but the damage or revelation was complete. Every person on that range now understood that the quiet private they'd dismissed or mocked or underestimated for 3 weeks was actually one of the most decorated soldiers in recent military history, operating under deep cover for a mission they still didn't fully understand. Captain Sterling emerged from the observation deck, her ice-blue eyes fixed on Emma with an expression that mixed shock with something approaching understanding. She approached slowly, then stopped directly in front of Emma, and extended her hand, a gesture that violated protocol but carried far more significance than any salute. I built my career by being harder than everyone else, Sterling said quietly. I thought that was the only way. You showed me there's a different path. She paused. Thank you. Emma shook her hand, her response minimal but genuine. You earned your position, ma'am. Nothing about that changes. Private Matthews approached next, his earlier aggression completely gone. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. I said things, I acted like... He trailed off, unable to find words adequate for the apology. You acted like a soldier under stress, Emma replied. We're good, Matthews. But she made no move to embrace forgiveness fully, no gesture that suggested past insults were forgotten completely. Justice had been served through revelation rather than revenge, which was perhaps more devastating to those who'd participated in her dismissal. Military service comes with unique financial challenges that most civilians never consider. Specialized financial planning services for active duty and veteran personnel address complex issues like deployment-related income fluctuations, VA benefit optimization, and strategic investment vehicles designed specifically for those who serve. Comprehensive life insurance policies tailored for high-risk occupations provide coverage levels that standard civilian policies simply cannot match. These financial instruments protect not just the service member, but their families during deployments and beyond. When you're putting your life on the line, your financial security deserves the same level of strategic planning as any military operation. Right now, you're probably thinking you know where this is going. Trust me, you don't. What's about to be revealed will shock everyone on that base, and it's going to shock you too. If you want to see stories like this every single week, stories about people who refuse to stay invisible, hit that subscribe button now. You won't regret it. The next 72 hours brought cascading consequences that reshaped Vanguard's command structure and training protocols. Lieutenant Cordova was formally charged with unauthorized disclosure of classified information and conspiracy with foreign intelligence services. The evidence Emma had gathered during her 0-30-hour visit to the communications building proved irrefutable. He'd been selling tactical training information to a private military contractor with known ties to hostile nations, compromising not just Vanguard operations, but multiple facilities using similar training protocols. His arrest led to 12 additional detentions across 4 military installations, unraveling a network that had been active for 7 years. The investigation revealed that Cordova's motivation had been purely financial. He'd accumulated over $300,000 in payments with no ideological component. Just greed enabled by opportunity and insufficient oversight. Sergeant Major Brennan received an official reprimand from General Reeves personally. Your conduct toward Lieutenant Hayes was not just unprofessional, Reeves told him in a meeting attended by multiple witnesses. It was a systematic attempt to undermine a classified operation through personal bias. You're being removed from training command effective immediately. Brennan accepted the judgment in silence, but his departure from Vanguard carried no ceremony or recognition of his previous service. He'd earned that outcome through choices that privileged prejudice over professionalism. Morrison approached Emma 3 days after the revelation with a formal request. Ma'am, I've compiled everything you taught Private Gonzalez during your morning sessions. Would you review it for a training manual revision? Your techniques are demonstrably superior to our current doctrine. Emma agreed, and over the following week she worked with Morrison to create what would eventually be designated the Phantom Protocol Advanced Tactical Training that integrated special operations methodology with standard infantry instruction. The manual remained classified but would be distributed to every advanced training facility in the U.S. military. Danny Torres and Alex Chen were promoted to team leader positions, their performance under Emma's guidance having exceeded every measurable standard. They'd gone from reject squad to facility exemplars in 3 weeks, a transformation that suggested the problem had never been their capability, but rather the instruction they'd received. Sterling requested a private meeting with Emma in week 4. They met in Sterling's office, away from observation and official record. "I need to apologize," Sterling began without preamble, "not just for dismissing you specifically, but for the entire framework I used to justify my career. I thought being the only woman meant I had to reject anything that looked like asking for accommodation or acknowledgement of difference. I see now that was just internalizing the same bias I was fighting against." Emma's response was characteristically direct. "You survived in an environment designed to break you. That required strategies that worked at the time. But environments change, and strategies should adapt." "Will you help me adapt?" Sterling asked. "Not just personally, but systematically. We need people who understand both the current culture and where it needs to go." "That's above my pay grade, ma'am." Sterling smiled slightly. "Actually, I checked with General Reeves. Your actual rank is lieutenant, not private, which makes us peers for purposes of policy development." She slid a folder across the desk. "JSOC has authorized your reassignment as senior instructor. 2-year commitment, full authority to redesign training protocols. You interested?" Emma opened the folder, scanning the authorization documents. Everything was official, properly classified, signed by people whose clearance levels made General Reeves look junior. "I need to complete my current mission first. Cordova's network. There are secondary contacts still unidentified. 3 more facilities potentially compromised." Sterling nodded. "Then take the assignment. Use Vanguard as home base while you complete the investigation. Best of both worlds." Emma considered for a moment, then extended her hand. "Deal." Transitioning from military service to civilian life requires specialized education and legal guidance that standard programs don't provide. Advanced certification courses in tactical operations, intelligence analysis, and specialized combat training can translate military experience into high-demand civilian security careers. Legal services specializing in military justice, security clearance issues, and veteran benefits claims provide critical support when navigating complex regulations. Educational benefits like the GI Bill can be maximized through strategic planning, covering not just traditional degrees, but also specialized technical training that commands 6-figure salaries in private sector security consulting roles. The story you just witnessed is real. These moments happen every day in our military, where excellence hides in plain sight until the moment demands it. If you want more stories of hidden heroes, of people who changed the game when everyone counted them out, this channel delivers every single week. Subscribe now and never miss a story of redemption and justice. 6 weeks after the revelation, on a Tuesday morning at 0600 hours, Emma stood alone on the range where Brennan had first thrown that rusted M16 at her feet. The rifle sat beside her, now fully restored to pristine condition through hours of careful maintenance. She'd kept it as reminder, and symbol excellence doesn't require perfect conditions, it creates them. Her encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming call. No caller ID, but she recognized the number from previous operations. "Hayes. Lieutenant, this is Colonel Marcus, JSOC Operations. We've identified 3 more facilities with potential security breaches matching Cordova's network. Fort Carson, Colorado is priority 1. We need someone who can go deep cover assess from inside." Emma looked at the restored rifle, then across the range where her students, she had 12. Now all volunteers were beginning to arrive for morning instruction. Torres waved. Gonzalez jogged toward her with visible enthusiasm. Chen was setting up target systems with Morrison's guidance. Timeline: 2 weeks for current obligations, then immediate deployment. Different base, different identity. High risk, high priority. Emma was quiet for 3 seconds, calculating. The work at Vanguard was incomplete but sustainable without her direct involvement. The network Cordova had been part of was larger than one facility, and each breach meant American lives at risk. The choice was already made before the question was asked. "I'll be ready." Outstanding. Briefing packet will arrive via secure courier tomorrow. Welcome back to operational status, Lieutenant. The call disconnected. Emma stood holding the phone, watching her students prepare for training that would make them better soldiers, watching the facility transform from place that had tried to break her into place she'd fundamentally reshaped. Torres jogged up, slightly breathless. "Ma'am, we're ready when you are. Also, where are you going? The rumor is you got reassigned." Emma smiled, a rare expression that transformed her usually neutral features. "I'm not going anywhere, Torres. Not for 2 more weeks." She picked up the restored rifle. "After that, we'll see." But before the official departure came unofficial ceremony. Master Sergeant Drake organized what he called recognition dinner at the base facility, attendance technically voluntary, but actually mandatory for anyone who wanted to acknowledge what Emma had done. General Reeves presented Emma with official commendation that would remain classified but existed in permanent record for extraordinary service in identifying and neutralizing security threats while maintaining operational security under extreme circumstances, demonstrating the highest standards of tactical excellence and personal integrity. Master Chief Harrison gave her second challenge coin, this one bearing no markings at all, just blank metal that somehow carried more meaning than any insignia could. "For the operators who can't be acknowledged," he said quietly, "so they know someone remembers." And when the formal part ended and the informal conversations began, Emma found herself surrounded by soldiers who dismissed her, mocked her, underestimated her, and now wanted to thank her or apologize or just understand how she'd maintained composure through 3 weeks of systematic dismissal. She handled each conversation with the same minimal grace that characterized everything about her brief, genuine focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on past injustice. Near midnight, as the gathering dispersed, Danny Torres caught her alone near the parking area. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "The tattoo, the numbers TF Black 072, what do they mean?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the desert sky where stars shone with impossible clarity. Task Force Black had 73 operators over its operational history. The 72 before me are all gone. Every single one. She looked at Torres. "The numbers are so I remember them. So someone remembers them." Torres absorbed this with visible emotion. "You're not planning to come back from wherever you're going, are you?" "I always plan to come back, Torres. Doesn't mean it works out that way." "Then take this." He pulled something from his pocket, a small metal cross on a chain worn smooth from years of handling. "My grandfather carried it through Vietnam, my father through Desert Storm. I carried it through my first deployment. It's supposed to protect the bearer." He pressed it into her hand. "You've protected enough people. Let something protect you for a change." Emma held the cross, feeling the weight of 3 generations of faith and service. "Torres, I can't." "Yes, you can. That's an order, ma'am, from your first student to his instructor." He smiled. "Besides, gives you reason to come back, to return it." Emma pocketed the cross without further argument. "Thank you, Torres." 2 weeks later at 05:30 on a Thursday morning, Emma stood in front of her assembled students one final time. They'd known this moment was coming, but knowledge didn't make it easier. "You're ready," she told them simply. "You've all exceeded every standard. Trust your training, trust each other, and remember, excellence doesn't require recognition. It requires commitment." Morrison stepped forward with something wrapped in cloth. "From all of us, ma'am." He unwrapped it to reveal the rusted M16, now fully restored and mounted on a display plaque with a simple inscription, "When everyone doubted one soldier proved excellence needs no perfect conditions." Emma accepted it with genuine gratitude. "I'll keep it safe." "You better come back to retrieve it properly," Gonzalez said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's an order from your second student?" "I'll do my best, Private." The transport helicopter landed at 0600 hours exactly. Emma boarded with single duffel bag that contained everything she needed for an identity she hadn't assumed yet. As the aircraft lifted off, she looked down at Vanguard one final time, the range where she'd shattered records, the compound where she'd revealed herself, the facility she'd fundamentally changed simply by being excellent when everyone expected her to fail. The helicopter banked east toward Fort Carson and whatever waited there. Emma settled into her seat, pulled out the challenge coin Harrison had given her, and allowed herself one moment of reflection before compartmentalizing everything for the mission ahead. Some warriors never retire, they just change battlefields. The helicopter climbed higher, Emma's silhouette visible against the dawn sky, serial number faintly visible on the fuselage TF Black Phantom 072. Then the aircraft turned and disappeared into the sunrise, carrying a ghost operator toward the next mission, the next identity, the next moment when someone would underestimate her and learn the same lesson Vanguard had learned. Excellence doesn't advertise. It simply performs when called. And Lieutenant Emma Phantom Hayes would keep performing until every security threat was neutralized, every fallen teammate was honored, and every soldier who deserved better training received it. The Ghost was operational again. And somewhere in the desert behind her, a restored rifle stood in a training office waiting for the day when its owner would return to claim it properly. Some promises are made to be kept. Some warriors refuse to stay buried, and some stories continue long after the telling ends.